Hello. Happy Thanksgiving to all my Canadian painters out there. And it's a lovely sunny Monday here on Vancouver Island. So today we're going to paint a little beach scene that I photographed at Neck Point Park. It's called Sunset Beach. Lovely spot to walk to. And I'm doing mine on a 5x7, but you can choose any size that you like. So let's get some paints ready and brushes and let's paint together. There, and then we've got the work area. So this morning I had one of those moments where I thought, I don't know if I sent this or not. I really think I did, but
You
I always,
did.
I always panic. I always panic because it was a couple of weeks ago and I searched through my sent box and I couldn't find it. Anyway, so this was one of the photos I took. And of course I left out the people. And the first painting that I did the logs exactly as they were in the photo, and I experimented with putting a little bit of quinacridone pink mixed with a bit of blue in the sky to sort of give it a bit of a color. I wasn't very happy with that. It sort of worked when we were doing it with oil paint, but it didn't. It's up to you, but I just felt it was too much color for the scene, didn't do much for it. And when the guy was oil painting with us, he never did the logs in the position that they were. He always just did the logs wherever he wanted to put them. He said, you want to have them kind of pointing into your painting. You want to have them close up, not too many of them. So instead of having them like the photograph, I did like he suggested. I put them just in a better position for the composition. So I think it looks better this way. Also, I enhanced the color. If you notice the color in the photographs, very, very gray, just a little bit of the sort of raw and burnt sienna. Again, that's not too interesting and it doesn't really lead you into the picture too well. So I've dialed up the color here and used some artistic license to really put them in the foreground, and with the directional ones draw you into the picture. So that's why it's a little bit different. What I really loved about the scene when I was looking at it was these trees, the way they are spaced and the way they, the rocks come down here. And it was very beautiful sort of out here too, with the open ocean and then a few more rocks. Couldn't fit all of that in. And that's one of the sad decisions you have to make when you do a painting, is what do you put in and what do you leave out. So when we start this one today, we're going to start with just the sky to start with. And we're going to be doing our very, very basic sky, which is wetting the sky down to this horizon line and wetting sort of loosely behind the rocks and the trees. Now you want to go right behind the trees, so you've got sky behind here. Doesn't really matter if your blue goes down here a little bit because you're going to put a lot of green and brown in there, but you want to kind of keep this area where the raw sienna is going to be. You want to keep that nice and white so you can have a lovely contrast of the light raw sienna with the dark here. And once we've wet this, we're going to add a little bit of the blue, cobalt blue mixed with cerulean, just in places, leaving white space so that it can all fuse together to make clouds. Now, interestingly, in the photograph, there's a couple of little white clouds here and here that are just like what happens when you have a little bit of kind of dry space in your wash. So don't even worry if you have a couple of, dry spots in your wash. Those little white clouds really did look like that. So I do have a little dry spot here. It looks like the original, surprisingly. So I've got my drawing here. I've got some lovely clean water, and I'm going to use my number 10 round to wet, because I don't like to fiddle about too much wetting. So I'm going to wet the sky and behind the trees. And I'm wetting first before I mix up my color, because I want the water to soak in while I'm mixing up my color. So make sure you're generous with the wetting. almost always needs soaking in time. And to get a nice straight line along the horizon, although it doesn't really matter with this one, I put my brush down and just pull it along that horizon line gently. Now what you never want to do is put it down so far that the metal furrow drags along your paper, because it'll make a big line. So just put it down far enough before the metal furrow connects, and make sure, now tip it. And like I said, it doesn't matter if you have a little dry spot where you're going to have a white cloud, but make sure you've got everything pretty much wet. I'm going to grab a Kleenex and just make sure I mop up any wet on the tape so it doesn't run back. And let that sit and soak in for a minute. And with my number 8 brush, I'm going to move it out of the way, bring my mixing tray over. Use a different pot of water, so I've got a clean pot. I want some Cobalt Blue and some Cerulean Blue. And if you just want Cerulean for a more summery sky, just use Cerulean. If you just want Cobalt for a sort of warmer sky, just use one. I tend to like the two mixed together. Now you don't want it too watery, because you have water all over your paper, and if you make this mix too watery, it'll just flood in and dissolve. You won't have any distinct blue. So what I did was I just put a little bit of water on there, a little bit of paint, no washing my brush in between. That introduces too much water into everything, and I have quite a good color there. I'll move that back out the way. And I'm just going to test it on the corner. I'm going to test it on this corner, and I'm going to see if it's too strong or if the background's wet enough. And I'm going to use my other number 10 brush. I'm just going to ease that in a little bit. And I'm going to add just a little bit more water, because it has soaked in, but I want it a little bit wetter. And I'm going to add a tiny bit more water to my mix. That test just told me it's a little bit too dry. It's not flooding as much as I want it to. And then I'm going to do the other corner and see if it will flood into the water. Add a little bit more water to my mix. The corners are a good place to do it, top of the sky, because they need to be a little bit darker than the rest of the sky. So as you come down the sky, you can add a little bit more water to your mix if you want. Now I'm being careful to make clouds as I go, which means I'm putting in a little bit of blue at the top and in the corners, and then I'm going to leave some white space. And as I'm wanting my mix less dark, I'm bringing it down a little bit, taking a tiny bit of water and just making it a little bit more dilute. So now I've got two places I can go. I can go to the darker mix or the lighter mix. And I want to leave a space here. You don't need to rush if your paper's good and wet. So leave a nice big space for your cloud. And remember to make your clouds different shapes. You don't want them to be all the same shape. If you leave enough space, they will form themselves. Try not to form them too much with your paintbrush. Let them do some work for you. Now I'm going to dip my brush in the water and add just a little bit more water to my mix, because I want it to sort of get a little bit lighter as I come down here. It's going to dry quite a lot lighter. And now I'm tapping my brush on my cloth, just controlling the water. And I'm going to come down, I'm going to go right, make sure I go right over that little tiny mountain range with the blue, because I'm going to go over those with a bit more blue later. And I want to go behind the trees so that I have a bit of blue behind the trees. At this point I can look at the top clouds and I can see if I'm going to dip in the slightly darker paint. I'm going to maybe add a little bit of blue so they're not quite so big. And remember, your blue will creep into your white, so and if your paper is too dry for this to happen, get your brush and wet it up a little bit before you run out of time, because you can just use a wet brush. Now you can see this corner here where I started is a little bit darker than everything else. I'm going to take a thirsty brush, wash, dry, and I'm just going to take a little bit of that off, just a little bit. I feel it's just a little bit too dark. Just gentle brush. And my brush is barely damp, just thirsty, and I'm wiping any excess off on my towel, which I have right here. I'm going to make sure that corner doesn't bleed back, and then I'm going to leave it alone, because the more you fiddle, the worse you're going to make anything. You want this to be doing it all by itself, just creeping in without any help from you, and quite light too. It was a very light, cloudy, sort of fairly misty day. The next part we're going to do is the grey beach, and we're going to work on dry paper to give us more control, because when we do the grey beach, we do not want to go over the logs. We want to make sure that the logs stay perfectly dry and they have nice crisp edges, and we can get beautiful light warm colors in the logs. So we're going to work on dry paper, and we're going to work around the logs carefully. You might want a number 6 or number 4 brush to do that. And we're going to mix up 2 colors. First of all, we're going to get raw sienna ready. I'm gonna protect my painting this time by just bringing my trays over. So I'm going to have some raw sienna ready to go for the lighter parts of the beach, the warmer parts. I'll show you the photo in a minute, what I mean. Now, I've got 2 raw siennas here. I've got a dark ochre one and a light raw sienna light. I'm sort of mixing them together. This other one here is yellow ochre. I'll mix some of that too, so you can see it's very similar, just a little bit more opaque. So I want that color for the light parts of the beach. And then I want to make a gray, and I'm going to use ultramarine blue and raw sienna and burnt sienna to make the gray. So I'm going to do that in my blue tray here. And I'm going to use that for that blue is going to be used for the ocean. So over the other side here, I'm going to get my ultramarine blue. Let's leave the other one for my ocean color later. And some raw sienna, which will make it go kind of green. And then some burnt sienna, because that's a bit more orange, we'll get gray. I want a little bit more ultramarine blue and a little bit more burnt sienna. And a test paper. I'm going to test that, see what I got. I'm going to look it against my painting. Yeah, I'm going to add a little bit more burnt sienna, a little bit more raw sienna. I don't want it too a little bit more blue. You have to go back and forth till you get the color you want. A little bit more blue. I don't want it to be too neutral. That's okay. That's good. It will blend with the raw sienna on the beach. I'm testing it out. So I'll get the photo and I'll show you what I mean. So what I'm looking at in the photo here is there's this sort of very light, it looks kind of greenish in the photo, but it looks better if you use a raw sienna because then it matches with everything else. So what we're going to do is in this area here, and maybe a little bit along here, is we're going to put the raw sienna on first, and then we're going to let the other gray blend with that wet in wet. And if you can see here, you can see underneath this, there's this little bit of raw sienna here and this little bit of raw sienna there. And I'm just going to let the grey blend in wet in wet. Later, when it's dry, I've put extra grey around the logs and under the logs and bits here. Also, you get a lovely crisp white edge to the ocean if you go with a second layer darker next to the edge here. It makes the ocean nice and crisp and light. But for now, we're putting on the first layer, dry paper. I'm going to switch to my number 6 brush, a little bit more control. And I'm going to start with my raw sienna. And because you're on dry paper, it needs to be quite liquid, otherwise you won't get a wet in wet happening. And I'm going to keep adding water to my mix until I know it's liquid enough. I'm going to put that here. If it's not liquid, you're not going to get any blending. So make sure that your paint is lovely and watery. I'm going to put a little bit of the raw sienna here. And then I'm going to go into my grey that I made. And I don't want my raw sienna to dry up before I get this grey on. Want it nice and sharp along the water's edge. So that's where I will concentrate my first layer. And I can't wait too long before I bring it up against the raw sienna so that I get that mixing happening. Don't paint over your raw sienna. You paint up to the edge and possibly over it just a little bit. Remember, keep your logs dry. Once you've got the main grey in, you can take your time going around your logs. You will feel maybe that your grey's too dark as you start. It will lighten up as it dries and will make your logs look much brighter and lighter. So don't worry too much. These two colours we're using, 3 colours, the Ultramarine Blue, the Burnt Sienna and the Raw Sienna, are all easy to wash off and lift. So if we need to lift out some colour, it's super easy to do so. I'm actually getting distracted. I need to go up against this raw sienna before I do anything else. Using the very point of my brush now so that I have a lot of control and I can get some nice crisp edges to those logs. And just fill in that last little bit. Oh, and there's a little bit of grey. I mustn't forget the small bits. A little bit of grey under here. Under this log. And right on the corner. Corners are really important to get them filled up with dark colour if you can. And if I almost run out of paint, if you've run out of paint at this stage, it's okay, because this doesn't have to match up to any of the other areas. It's fine like that. So I've got in my dark greys. Again, don't touch them. Don't touch them with your paintbrush once you're done, because you will start to lift them off. Don't worry if they're not blending well. Wait till they're dry and do a bit of blending with a damp brush. And don't forget, you're going to be able to do a bit more work on them with bits of seaweed and pebbles and stuff, so you can put more texture in when it's dry. Don't worry too much. There's a lot you can do after the paint is dry. I'm going to mix up a little bit more of that grey because I'll be using it again for the rocks, so I just have some ready. I've used most of mine. Now the next place we're going to work, we're trying to work on all the dry spaces so we don't have to do too much drying. What we're going to do up here is we're going to put in raw sienna on a lot of this dry grass on top of the rocks and some of the logs here. And while the raw sienna is wet, we're going to add a little bit of burnt sienna. Now later, when that's all dry, we can add touches of green when that's all dry, but mostly we want the raw sienna on all of this part and a little bit on the logs. And we also need some here, but we need to wait until this gray is dry, because what we want here is this little bit of light separation from the water and the sand, and we don't want it all kind of bleeding together. So we're going to have a bit of raw sienna here later when this is all dry. Make sure this is dry all the way up here on these logs, and then while that's wet, a little bit of burnt sienna in there to give it some touches of warmth. So what I have mixed up already is I have a puddle of the raw sienna, or you can use yellow ochre. I have my burnt sienna, and mine is a very orangey red. It's pigment red 101. That's the one I prefer. Some don't use that pigment, they use a brown pigment. I don't like the brown pigment, it's too grainy. So yours may not look like mine if you don't have the PR 101 pigment. So don't worry about that, that's okay. It's going to be a good brown. So I have those ready for the next part. I'm going to switch to my number, what size brush? 4. I'm going smaller each time because the area is getting smaller. I've got my number 4 brush and my raw sienna, and I'm going to go over the tops of these. Now, if you've got grey rocks in there, you can put those in later over the top of the raw sienna. That will be fine. I'm going to leave the darker grey rocks that come down the bank unpainted. That's this big area down here. And there'll be grey rocks up here, that's okay. I'm going to paint the tops of these rocks with some raw sienna because they can be reflecting the light. There's a few little logs on the beach over here. I'm going to paint those with some raw sienna. A little area just over here. I think there's a whole bunch of logs on the beach over there. And then I'm going to take my burnt sienna. I'm just going to add a little bit of that burnt sienna wet in wet. Not too much, because you want it quite light, but I want to have that matching the raw sienna and burnt sienna of the logs when I get there, and just have a bit of warmth in that. So it's not too much, just a little tiny bit of warmth so they blend wet and wet. Don't do too much or it will be too brown. And of course it will dry lighter. I'm going to lift just, great thing with these colors, like I said before, is you can lift them. So I've got my thirsty brush. I'm going to lift a little bit of light on some of those. The logs on the beach look almost white in the photograph, But I did find when I tried leaving them just white in a painting, they looked like I just missed out a bit of the painting. So I do want to have a tiny bit of colour in them. And at this stage, I want everything to be dry so that I can work on all of the next parts without worrying about anything bleeding together. So while you're working on that, I'm going to turn off my microphone, turn on my hairdryer, and just make sure everything is dry. Make sure my tape is pressed down after the warmth of the hairdryer so it doesn't lift up. I do avoid the tape with my hairdryer because if you get the glue too warm, it will just lift up and then you'll get big kinks in your paper. The really nice thing about this painting is that we only use a few colors. So the whole thing stays harmonious, the same sort of 3 blues, the raw sienna, the burnt sienna, and just a little bit of yellow to make the green for the trees. So it's a very harmonious painting. And you do find with our scenes here, especially the scenes of the ocean, that the colors are very harmonious. There is just all the similar blues and the greens and that little bit of warmth from the burnt sienna and the raw sienna make a lovely combination. And what we'll be working on next after this is all dry is putting in the ocean, which means we need some raw sienna reflections and some blue ocean that's very, very similar to the sky color. The little tiny range of mountains, which of course they're not tiny mountains, they are the mainland coastal mountains over here. You couldn't see them very well on this very sort of misty, damp day, but we know they're there, and it makes a nice division between the horizon and the sky to have them there. So I've made sure I put them in. Also, the photo often doesn't give you exactly what you see at the time. We could definitely see them in more definition than came out on the photo. So all we use is another layer of the sort of sky and ocean color just to put those in when the ocean is dry. Oh, just check in to see how everybody's doing. I think maybe you're ready for the next stage. And I have my raw sienna. And first of all, with the raw sienna, quite diluted, I'm adding a little bit of water to it. We're going to want some of those reflections from the rocks. Now, whenever I'm doing water, I make sure that all of my brush strokes stay horizontal, and I was talking to Jan about this earlier in the year. The other way that you can have the strokes is when it comes up to the shore, the lines become parallel with the shoreline. And there has to be a little bit of transition between that. If you look at the photo, a lot of these lines here are on a very slight angle rather than the horizontal, and they gradually come towards that edge of the shoreline. But you have to be subtle about it, because if you have your lines too off the horizontal, it doesn't look like a reflection in the water. So I've got my raw sienna on there. It doesn't matter if my blue merges with that, if it's a little bit damp, because when this is all dry, we're going to put in the dark green reflections, but it has to be dry first, otherwise we're not going to get a dark green. And you can kind of see here that there's this much lighter reflection, very blurred, and a little bit of the raw sienna and then the dark green. So we can blur and lift a lot of it later, but first we need this. And then for the ocean color, we're going to mix a little bit of ultramarine blue with our sky color. So here's our sky color, the cobalt and the cerulean, and I'm just going to mix a tiny bit of ultramarine blue in with that. and water it down. We do not want this ocean to be too dark. It's reflecting a very light sky, so I'm adding a bit of water to that. Ultramarine blue just makes it a little bit warmer. It doesn't have to be that much different to the sky. I also want it to be very, very light near the shore, so I'm going to put a little bit of water on there so that I don't get too dark near the shore. The place that the ocean is the darkest is along the horizon. So I'm going to do that first to check and see, is my color a bit too dark or not? It's okay, but now I'm coming in with a wet brush, just a wet brush, before it dries too much, to just ease that ocean color in so it's not too dark. That's why I'm using a little brush. I've got my number 4 brush. I want it big enough to get the paint on, but not so big that I don't have this control. I've got a little island. I don't want to paint over the rocky islands, otherwise they're going to be too dark, too gray. So I'm very gently putting in the background of the ocean. Again, horizontal brush strokes at all times. Going very carefully around the rocks here. And I'm getting more water with my mix. I don't want it to be too strong. It needs to be really light. I'm going to switch to my number 6 brush. I'm going to switch to a slightly bigger brush. More water with my mix. I'm going to come into this raw sienna just gently like this. Bit more water with my mix. And we're going to transition that with the green later. So don't worry about it too much. I'm just getting a little bit more blue, and I want to come along parallel now to the shoreline rather than horizontal. You have to just gently switch from one to the other. And I want to keep that shoreline just kind of a little tiny white stripe. Very, very, very tiny. And like I say, don't worry about this area because we're going to go in there with some dark green. I'm going to go over the raw sienna a little bit because that will form a green. And just leave that tiny, tiny little bit of white along the shore. And I'm going to make sure I just don't have too much paint on the tape. And I'm looking at the horizon, just wondering if I need a touch more dark along the horizon. At certain times of the day, you'll see a white line along the horizon, and at other times of the day, you will see a darker line along the horizon. So at this time of the day, which was, I think, about 11 o'clock in the morning, it was a dark line along the horizon. When this is dry, we can also put a few little blue ripples on the ocean, such as here, with a dry brush. And of course, I'm going to put all this green in when it's dry too. So don't worry if this area looks a little bit odd. And what we can work on while that is drying all by itself, we will work on the logs with the raw sienna and the burnt sienna again. And a dark brown made with the ultramarine blue and the burnt sienna. I will make sure that I've got plenty of plenty of the raw sienna for the log tops. I've got several logs, so I want to make sure I got plenty ready and that it's wet. See, they're drying up, so I need to add a bit of water to my burnt sienna. Make a bit more so that I've got plenty. And then for the shadows on the logs and the rocks, I want, especially on the logs, I want a dark brown. So again, I've got the burnt sienna, same mix I made for the grey, but a bit more brown. So burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. And I'm going to mix that till I get a dark brown rather than a grey. Get my test paper, test it out. I need a bit more burnt sienna. I test it next to the grey. I can see if it's dark brown or grey. And it's much more brown. Same two colours. I've just added a bit more burnt sienna to make them slightly more brown. And of course, all of these colours can be lifted and washed off if you want to lighten them, if you get them too dark to start with. Let's move those back out the way. What I'm trying to do, you may have noticed, is I'm trying to be really clean and not splatter paint all over my painting like I usually do. It's a little easier with a small painting. I think I'm going to use my number 6 brush, and I'm going to start with raw sienna, and I'm going to go one log at a time. And because I'm right hand dominant, I'm going to start over on the left so I don't smudge anything. And I'm going to put the raw sienna on the whole log first. Painting, I always paint in the direction of the objects I'm painting. So this log goes in this direction across here, and part of it's under here. Paint my brush strokes in that direction. I'm going to wipe my brush on my towel, and the easiest way to get a soft transition on the log is to lift the paint after you put it on. I'm just going to lift a little bit off the top of the log. It just makes a really soft highlight rather than having to wet it first, which can give you a big background. Now, before I'm finished, I'm going to get my burnt sienna and I'm going to put that along the bottom of the log. Just not worrying about where it goes. I can lift it off later. A little bit over here. I'm going to wipe my brush on my towel. Just lift a little bit up here. It's obviously not dark enough at the bottom yet, but we'll do that in the next layer. What we want is just a roundness look, a round look to the log where the base down here is darker and the top is lighter. That's what we want, with a soft transition in between. I'm just going to use my thirsty brush to just soften the transition in the middle and then leave that log. Now, I can work against that one, but I want to leave this one here dry for a moment, and I'm going to work on the one back here, because by the time I've done that one and this first one will be plenty dry enough to work on. So again, I've got my raw sienna, and I'm going to do these ones back here. They're in the distance, so they don't need quite as much detail. Again, I'm painting in the direction of the log with the point of my brush. They're quite light on top, so thirsty brush, which means I clean my brush, take the moisture off, and just take a little bit off the top of the log. And then quickly into my burnt sienna and put that along the bottom of the logs. Now we'll define the two logs with some dark brown later. Not too much fuss. If your burnt sienna goes too far up the log, wash your brush, dry your brush and just use your thirsty brush to transition them softly in the center. That will make your log look round. They're kind of fun to do, I think. I rather like doing logs. Now, these two logs are bigger. I think I'll be okay with my number 6 brush, so let's see. So it's the same procedure for all of them, because this is the base of the log, the base colors. Detail comes later. I'm putting the raw sienna on. Kind of quickly because I don't want it to dry up too fast. Wash my brush because I might take a little bit off the top here, and drag my thirsty brush along the top to lighten it up. Not at the end. The end's going to be much darker, so let's get the top a little bit lighter. And then straight into my burnt sienna for the base. And the end. The end's kind of rough, so you can be a bit bitty with your brush strokes. And I've got my brown that I have made, and at the end of the log here, well, this is still wet because the end is quite a lot darker. I'm going to use some of that brown to start the shadows in the end of this log. Now these are just the wet and wet shadows. We can put some stronger, more detailed ones on later. That's okay. Put a little bit down here. Now this is our main log that's right in the forefront of our painting, so we can do more detail on this main log, more color. And we've got one more log left to do. My raw sienna. And yes, I've got wet paint here. I will make sure that I'm okay with that by just leaving a slight patch of dry paper between the two logs. It only has to be probably less than a millimeter of dry paper between the two, and they won't blend together. Or you can have them blend together. It really doesn't matter. That's watercolor for you. You can make it do whatever you want. Into my burnt sienna. And put that along the end and the underside. A little bit more on this one. Thirsty brush again, and I'm just going to lift the light off the top. This thirsty brush technique is the perfect way to make things round and soft looking. A little bit of the dark brown just along the base. And then we want some burnt sienna around the end here. And a little bit of dark brown. What's happening with this log here is that there's sort of rough edges, so I'm using my thirsty brush into it's very clean and it's almost dry. I'm poking it into the damp brown to get those kind of rough edges. We can do more of that, and what I'm talking about here, what I'm doing is, instead of this gray log, I'm using some of these details in the gray log to make this log. I'm making up the colors, but I want these kind of rough details at the end. And while I have that dark brown that's just damp, I'm poking my thirsty brush into it to just get that rough edge. And this log's drying up a little bit, so I'm going to add a little bit more burnt sienna along this edge. In that kind of wood grain direction. Damp brush again, I want to transition that softly, so with my damp brush I'm going to blend that in so it has a soft transition from light to dark. A little bit of the dark brown, go along the bottom edge with the dark brown while the burnt sienna is still wet. And you can see with a few layers, a little bit of fuss, a little bit of playing, you're going to get these details on these logs. It doesn't all come at once. And what I'm using is, I'm using the photo of the logs to help me with the detail, but it doesn't have to be in the same place that I see it on these logs. It can be in a different place, but I'm just using it to help me form that kind of a pattern. So right now what I'm looking at two logs for this pattern. I'm looking at this log for that pattern, and I'm looking at this log. So I want to have a little bit of this kind of happening and a little bit of this sort of happening. And because it's a painting and a watercolor, I don't want to go overboard with the detail. It's not hyper realistic. I just want to have a little bit of the detail so it's clear, absolutely clear, that these are logs and not hot dogs or something laying on the beach. It has to read as a log. Now I'm making up a little bit more dark brown because I've used it all. And I'm going to put a little bit more dark on these logs, and they're fairly dry. So I'm going to have to use a damp brush, a clean damp brush, to blend them in. I've still got my number 6 in my hand, but what I often do is I have a separate brush to use as a damp brush, and that's actually probably what I should be doing. A little bit of burnt sienna. I want to get a dark edge to this log here. And transition it to the light top. And that makes it look even more round. And this one I'm just adding a bit more dark. Again, to make it look more round. And then I'll work on this one when that one's a little bit drier. So again, I'm going back and forth, going between the different logs. Add a little bit of dark on the one underneath here. Blending it in. The logs are probably going to be your longest process on this, and you may even tomorrow look at them and still, when they're dry, think, I just want to add a bit more detail to them. So the end of this one's fairly dry, so I want to put the sort of the rings of the log on the end there. It's not perfectly dry, so I can get that kind of a soft blending of the dark brown. And this one needs a lot of work, but it's still quite damp, so I'm going to leave that one till it's much drier to work on this one. I could a little bit of burnt sienna. I'm going to add a little bit of blue to the burnt sienna, but not a lot. So I just added a little bit of blue to the burnt sienna. It just makes it a little bit more grey. And I'm going to use that to have a bit more shadow on this side of the log. And more of the wood grain sort of detail. Wet brush. Blend it in a little bit. And very soft, dry brush shading here. And again, you can do lifting as well. All these colors will lift. So if you want to lift a bit of wood grain into there, that works too. And there is an incredible amount of texture in the log. So you can do a lot of lines and it still looks fine. I'm just going to grab some blue, and I'm just going to put some blue right over the top of that there. Just here. Blue over the top of brown will make a nice grey. And so that I have a contrast, I'm going to make the closest log fairly detailed, and this one fairly detailed, but I'm going to leave this one quite smooth so that there's a contrast between the three, that they're not all detailed. Otherwise that overpowers the eye. It doesn't matter that in the photo there's lots of detail. You make decisions for your art that are the best decisions for looking at the art, for the viewer. So to have three that are really detailed is going to be too much really for the viewer to look at. They're not going to look at any of this up here if they're looking at all this detailed log. What you've got here is one with less detail, so it stands out, pointing towards your main scene. My main focal point that I feel is these trees. I loved the pattern of these trees, so my log is pointing to them, and it's the one that stands out as different to the other two. This log is just providing a juxtaposition to these three, which are all going in this direction, and sort of pointing this way towards the ocean. I could have left it out. Kind of felt like there would be too much open space on the beach. And there was that kind of lovely V shape made with these logs. So That's what we're doing. Now I'm going to use my very tiny 0 brush, and I'm just going to fill in those mountains while this is all drying. And for that, I'm just using my sky color with the tiniest bit of ultramarine blue added. It's just, my sky color is still here in my palette. I just grabbed a little bit of ultramarine blue, added it to that with some water. My tiny little number 0 brush. This is all wet, so I have to be very careful. And I'm going to see if that's too dark. It is, so I want to add a bit more water to that. I don't want them to be too dark. They have to just sort of be a little bit darker than the ocean and the sky. Add a little bit more water to that, still a bit too dark. Take them across. I'm just gonna dab my Kleenex on that one because it was a little bit too dark. And take that across here. There's a big piece of rock sticking up over here, so I don't want to paint that blue. I'm going to leave that for rock color. And just pop that in. They should be, and if yours are too dark, just do this. Grab a Kleenex and just dab it on them. They should be almost the color of the sky. Just slightly darker. The other thing I can do while I have that color is I can do some dry brush on the ocean. So with a bigger brush, grab some of that color. I'm going to get rid of it on the towel. I'm going to test it on a piece of scrap paper to see if I can get that dry brush sparkle. And I can. So parallel to the shoreline, I'm just going to drag that dry brush over the ocean. With the point of the brush, just going to put in a couple of little waves. I got my damp brush again just to blend them in. Same with back here. Just going to put in a few waves. Maybe should have used a smaller brush. It's coming together, isn't it? So while you're catching up with your logs and everything and your mountains, I'm going to read my notes, make sure I go to the next step that I'm supposed to go to. I need a bit more grey. It's dried up quite a bit. So same thing, ultramarine blue. I'm going to mix a dark grey for the slightly darker rocks and then a lighter one. So ultramarine blue and the burnt sienna. You can use Payne's grey, but then you'd have to keep modifying it with burnt sienna to get it browner or grayer. So you might as well use these two colors. And they're very, very easy to wash off or change. So that's I've got a little bit more ultramarine blue than I had in before because I wanted a dark brown before. So that's my darker grey for the rocks. And for my lighter grey, I'm pretty sure I used Cobalt Blue and Raw Sienna. Yes, I did. I was just checking. So here I've got all my blues, a bit more cobalt there. Cobalt is a gentler blue than ultramarine, not quite as granulating. So it's just a little bit gentler, makes a softer grey. And Raw Sienna, I think I grabbed too much on my brush there. A bit more blue. I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna to that, just because that gives it a bit of orange, that just changes the color a little bit. and test it. Let's test, see what we got. It's going to need a bit more water with it. A bit more water. That's better. I don't want it too dark for the light grey. And then I'm going to test the dark grey. Well, that's good, because you can go darker in a second layer. But we'll start with those two. They look okay. Move that out the way. Put this back. So what we're working on, I'll bring the photo here. What we're working on is all of these rocks that you can see here are sort of, they're actually kind of a raw sienna-y grey. So I can add a little bit more raw sienna to that light grey to get that raw sienna look. We're going to have some of the rocks coming through up here, and these ones have a little bit of a burnt sienna look to them as well. So I can have a little bit of burnt sienna on the side to mix the two, wet in wet. So what I'll do here is, I have those greys I've just mixed. I'll move that out. I've got to try and be clean. Grab a little bit of raw sienna, and I'm going to put it right here beside my grey that I made with the raw sienna, so that I can grab a little bit of one or a little bit of the other. And next to my dark grey that I made with the burnt sienna, I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna next to it. So I can have a little bit of wet in wet, burnt sienna and grey. So I have all those colours happening in the rocks, wet in wet. And it's quite, I mean, it's quite a small area in this painting, so we don't have to fuss with it too much. It's just really lovely to have a wet in wet look to your painting. I want a small brush. I'm going to use my number 2 brush. And I'll start over here with these little logs here that I said you can see a little bit of raw sienna in them. So I'm going to start with raw sienna mixed with the grey, and you can kind of see it here. I'm going to put that in. Then I'm going to get the more bluey grey. I can put the detail in later. The detail doesn't have to go in straight away. I'll rest my hand on that because I think I got paint on my hand. And I'm going to take the soft bluey grey over and just let it blend with that raw sienna look. Now this is not dark enough. This is our first layer. I'm actually going to grab a bit of the burnt sienna here, a tiny bit on the tip of my brush, because there's a warm look. A warm look to these logs, and not logs, rocks. I can't get my rocks and my logs separated in my mind. And then I'm going to go back to the bluey grey colour. Now, there are some logs on the beach, so I'm going to go around them. And carefully work around them. Now I'm going to go into the darker brown, grey. I can't get even my colours sorted out, let alone my logs and rocks. And this one that's sticking up into the sort of ocean colour here, I want to make sure that's well defined in the darker grey for contrast. With something this small, with a painting this small, you can't be too realistic or subtle. If you're doing a much bigger painting, if you've made yours 8 by 10, you've got more space, you've got way more space to play with the colors of your rocks. But this is just a tiny space, so can't do too much detail. And I want the contrast back here. And I'm going to just come along the edges of those logs so that I get the contrast of the light and the dark there too. And there's a rock out here. Again, I can't fiddle about with that with too much detail, so I'm going dark. A little bit of dark around these, around the edge of the shore here. Where the water's edge is, there's always shadow. It's always going to be darker. I've got my wet thirsty brush now. I'm just going to wet those in. And what I'm also going to do with my wet thirsty brush is just a little bit of detail, and that's to lift off just a tiny bit of that dark grey on that edge of that rock. Just a tiny, tiny bit. I'm working quite slowly. I'm working on dry paper. I can work wet and wet. There's some shadow on these rocks here. It's darker along the edge. So I can put some of that dark grey in just wet and wet. And when this is dry, I can also add a little bit more dark for definition. And I'm coming up to a sort of like, there's like a little sort of a pebbly beach area just here that's quite light. So I'll put that in with the light grey. Come up against the edge of those rocks that come down. And take my dark grey. And there's some real dark edge to the rocks here. And I know I said I can't do much detail, but I can do a little bit just to make sure that it reads as rocks and logs. So there's a big rock sticking out here. I'm going to put a little bit of the burnt sienna on the edge of it. And then the dark grey on the other edge. Kind of like that. Use my thirsty brush to transition them together. And you can see we've already got some shapes forming here. I can go darker behind these rocks to make them stand out more. Now while these edges are drying, so I can have the rocks coming down into them and they look separate, I'm going to use my dark grey, still my number 2 brush, and I want to put some of the rocks that are here covered in this dry grass. Well, I'm working on dry paper, so I can be very careful, I can be very slow. At this point, I have a lot of colors where my grays are. Let's just pull back a little bit. And I'm just sort of dipping into them all over the place. I can get some darker blue gray here, I can get some bluer gray here, I get some brown gray here. And at this point, when I want a whole bunch of different grays on my brush, I just sort of dip in wherever I feel I want the color. So I'm just going into the sort of lighter area now for some rock down here. It doesn't even matter if it's not exactly like the photo. I'm just going a little bit lighter now. Because you've got the raw sienna and the burnt sienna on there, you have to go darker most of the time, but that was white paper there. And they're quite rugged. And what I have in front of me is the photo so that I can actually look at the shapes of the rocks and how they come down, and that's going to help me get believable shapes as I paint them. See, sometimes you see the face of the rock and the tops of them are covered in this dry grass. So you sort of see what I'm looking at is these kind of like triangular shapes that all look a little bit random as you're doing them. But when you pull back and you look at the whole thing, and when the paint's dry, it starts to look like what it's supposed to be, which is rocks covered in grass. The main thing is to get the direction of them, like they're coming down in this kind of diagonal direction. And they kind of flatten out here. And I'm going to use a bit of a dry brush here because it's tapping it on my towel, because this is kind of like a bit more textured here. There's sort of rock and grass. I'm just using a dry brush for that. And over here too, I'm going to get some of that light grey, dry my brush off, and just drag it across this here to get that kind of rock and grass look. And same here. I want this lighter here, then I'm going to drag some dark across that later. So if I close up, that sort of looks a bit odd, but once you pull back and once everything starts to dry and you get a little bit of green in there, it's all going to make sense. I'm actually going to just use my thirsty brush to take a little bit of the color off of that, blend it in a little bit more. Zoom in. Now this is drying. I want my light gray first. And I'm going to put all these in with the light gray. I'm going to do the dark gray on these afterwards. Put the light gray in just as a wash first. And on the ones over here to the right, they're a little bit warmer. So I want a more burnt sienna gray. I've actually got quite a bit of burnt sienna on my brush, but I'm going to have that as my undercolor, and then I'll be coming over the top later with a cooler gray, but I want the warm undertones under these rocks. It's my smaller brush. And I'm running low on dark grey, so I'm just going to mix a bit more up so that I can put in this quite dark rocks here where it transitions from the pebbles to the rocks. A lot more to go in on the rocks, but we've got a bit of the base colour in there. Using my just wet thirsty brush to give some shadow and shape there. And I have my Kleenex over all of this because my hands tend to get paint on them, so I just want to protect it. I've got to see, I get paint on the sides of my fingers and I don't want to get that, leaning that on my paintings. That's why I cover it up a little bit with a paper towel to avoid that. Now there's still a lot of detail to do in the darker greys in these rocks, but we'll just wait till that light grey is dry. A lot of this light grey is dry, so I can take my very small brush and I can suggest all these individual rocks just with little tiny lines. I don't have to paint every individual rock. Just some little tiny lines to suggest that we have individual ones there. There is just a sort of a pebbly bay there that's light grey, so that's a nice, again, it's a break for the eye, just like the log that doesn't have the texture. And some bigger rocks. And shadows. With things like this, I like to start them and then just leave them for a bit and come back to them, let a bit dry, do something else, and then come back to them later, and then look at them again, and then come back to them a bit more after that. They don't have to be done all in one go, and it gives your eye a break to do something different for a while, because then you see them differently when you come back to work on them. Adding some of the textures on these ones. And again, I'm dipping into different colors. Sometimes I'm dipping into a little bit of burnt sienna, sometimes I'm dipping into a darker gray. Mainly going in with the darks, so. And sometimes you want a bigger patch of dark. Again, so that it's not all bitty. You don't want it all to be bitty and little pebbles. Sometimes you want a nice patch of dark to give the eye a break. And that's another reason to stop, pull back, do something else, and then come back and look at it and think, is that too busy for my viewers? Are they looking at too much there, too much going on? Can I simplify it with just one big dark shape? And sometimes that really works well. So you can see, like, I'm building up really slowly. This rock here has quite a dark shadow on. This rock here has quite a dark shadow on. There's one here with a bit of a shadow, but not too many of them. This one, now it's dry, I can put a bit more dark shadow on the edge. There's maybe some logs sticking out here that I can put here. And this is very dark here. Now we're going to have some, also we're going to have some greenery coming down as well. So pretty soon I got to think about adding the greenery. I know I could leave you for about an hour to work on these rocks because they're fun to really get into. Well, some people hate it. Some people don't find them fun at all, but I do. I find it fun to just keep finding the shapes, the shadows, the crags, the edges. Just look for shapes. Like as I'm looking at this, I'm seeing quite often in these rocks sort of triangular shapes forming the shadows. So if you sort of put your base gray in and then add those dark triangles or the shapes that you see, it's the shapes that will give you the correct look. And you don't have to do every rock all together all at once. A few at a time, here and there. There's one in the water here. Got my little tiny brush. Another one in the water here. Some at the water's edge here. And don't forget, we still have reflections to do yet, so. Just little details like having a few rocks actually in the water are really nice details to put in. Because you have this edge, but then you have the edge broken up by little bits of rock. Kind of fun. Same here, there's sort of one here. And you can play with that on the beach too. You don't have to do that at this point, but it's usually my finishing thing that I do. I will put the all of the bark and the seaweed and stuff that's the detritus that's all sitting on the beach here. Using the burnt sienna with a little bit of the blue here for this sort of bark that's all laying on the beach. And I'm not rushing you to do this now, I'm just showing you what you can do for finishing touches if we don't get that far. Or if you've got that color on your brush and you want to do something while you're waiting for me. Sometimes I'll make it like bark shape, and there's pebbles and there's seaweed, so I'm just doing sort of little dot shapes for that. Dot, 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 drag a bit of stuff, dot, 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 drag. Not too much, you don't want to fill up your whole beach with it, but it gives it that rough beach look, and not just the flat grey. See, I'm carried away with this now. I have to do a bit more. But those are all things you can do when you're waiting for paint to dry. When you think, well, I've got a dry spot, I can't work on the wet paint right now, but I can go in and do some things on the beach. A lot of the sort of burnt sienna look is the bark, big chunks of bark off the log. So I've got just burnt sienna here. I'm doing that with. I'm just going to take a little bit of the dark bluey grey. I'm going to put it along the shore here to darken it up. Then a wet brush to just blend that in, because it's always really nice to have a bit of a dark edge close to the water, just close to the viewer. Hard for me to put my brush down once I get going. I'm thinking I've got dark brown on my brush, dark grey rather. I can put a shadow under this log while I got dark grey on my brush. That's the way I paint. I tend to paint all around the painting with whatever colour I've got. I think, where else can I use that colour for the moment while I'm waiting for other parts of the painting to dry? And I have dark grey here, and I have a little brush, and it's a great time to put in some of these shadows under the rock, which will really, really make the light logs. See, they're not rocks, are they? They're logs. My language brain doesn't work when I'm painting. I'm going to go even darker here with a bit of shadow. And especially under this one. Otherwise, see, this log just looks like it's sticking out, floating. And I can ground it onto the beach with a nice dark shadow. Sorry if I'm going somewhere you're not painting. But this is a really good way to manage your painting. It's a bit here, a bit there. And I'm just going to use a damp, clean brush just to soften just the edge of that shadow, just a little bit more grey here. And you can see that puts it down on the beach rather than sticking up in midair, going even darker, close to the log. You can never go too dark close to something. There's so little light when you get really close up to a shadow. The other thing here is I've formed two logs over here. There's actually a log behind, so I can put the dark on that behind log on now that the other one's dry, and just separate them. A few more petals. Now, I'm not finished the logs either. I'm pulling back now so you can kind of see how everything's working together, and why I skip around a bit of this, bit of that, bit of this, bit of that. It helps you work when you're not focused on just one thing at a time, because you get so caught up in that one thing that you can't see it properly, or you think it's not working. It's really important to pull back all of the time and look at the whole painting and work on different areas so you don't get too bogged down in one area. And everything needs to harmonize, everything needs to hang together. So I'm going back in again. So when you've done all those sorts of, I haven't finished the rocks yet. I don't want to quite yet. I want to put some of the greenery in. I want to give my brain a little bit of a break from the rocks, and then I'll go back to them and put a little bit more detail in. I feel I've done enough for my brain on that area right now. And the next thing we're going to put in are the trees and the greenery. Now, what you can do while you have the dark browny grey, and what I did, is put in the tree trunks. I'm going to use my very thin liner brush, or you can use a 0 or number 1. That's my thin, very thin 2/0 script liner. I'm going to get that dark brown grey color. It doesn't matter what color these tree trunks are. They're in the distance and they look like a dark browny grey. We don't have to do much fussing with them because they're not close up. So I'm rolling my liner brush in that. And I'm going to start at the base of the trunk and pull my brush upwards. I'm just going to get the shapes of the tree trunks in. I really liked how these ones crossed over, these two right on the edge of the point there. I'll put those trunks in first. This one a little bit further away is a bit thicker. I might have to do 2 brush strokes for this one. Let's get the first one in. And then load my brush again. Get the second stroke in because it is a little bit of a thicker tree trunk. Even a thicker tree trunk is not that thick. Just slightly thicker than the others. And there's some more crossing over trees. Each time I do a tree trunk, I load my brush up with a bit more paint. There's a couple close together here. You don't want it too light. You want to be able to see your brush strokes at least. There's some very little like bushy trees here. Even though it was June, and this one didn't have any leaves on, I don't think. It was just little branches here. Taller ones. There's kind of a mess of different scrubby looking trees here, not very healthy looking ones. This one's got sort of dry branches at the top. There's quite a few branches in between them. If you haven't finished your rocks, don't worry, take a break from your rocks. Use your rock color, do your tree trunks. You come back to your rocks in a little while. As I got over to this edge, I probably invented a few trees just to fill the space better, and because I sort of ran out of patience with them. Sometimes I just run out of patience with the drawing. I think I can't count the trees anymore. I've lost track. And at that point, I just invent a couple, especially if they don't come in the right place on my paper. The ones that have a nice shape, I do like to put them in. There's sort of a bigger one here that does have an interesting bend at the top, like that. Put that one in a little bit bigger. It has a couple of branches coming off here. Now I know they don't have any greenery on yet. I'll do that in just a moment. And of course they're drying a little bit lighter, so I'm just going to go over a couple of them that are light. Put some of the small branches on. And also what I often do is I put some branches on afterwards. I put a bit of greenery on and then I will connect a few branches. That one goes up there and that one comes across here like that, kind of bend on that one. Yeah, that's good enough for now. And because we're working on dry paper with those, it'll dry really quickly, and we can go in with the green really, really soon. I'm looking at mine, and again, this is another thing that I do is after the paint's dry, I'll look at it and I'll think, that line, that horizon line here, it's not really showing up dark enough. So my little brush, I just want to add a bit more dark paint in there, a little bit, just a little bit more ultramarine blue along that horizon line. I just didn't feel it was, I couldn't see it properly. I want to have a little darker in the background there. And of course we will be putting in all of these reflections here too. We haven't got those in there yet. Now, I love doing trees, so I really look forward to the tree part. And we're going to make a very basic green. We're not going to go far from the ultramarine blue. Discipline, Caroline, move your painting out the way. I'm going to use the ultramarine blue and everything that I've got here, all of the blues and whatever I've got. I'm going to make a green. I'm going to add some bright yellow. You can add whatever bright yellow you have. It might be Azo Yellow, it might be cadmium yellow, might be Indian yellow, it might be Hansa yellow. Any of those yellows, add it to your ultramarine blue until you get a nice green. It should be a bluey green, not too greedy green, because if you look at the photograph, and our trees around here, they are quite a bluey green, quite a dark green. When you come down to a little bit of the grass here, it's a bit lighter. So I think this one is fine. Mostly ultramarine blue. I'll put a bit more blue in, so I've got a bit more paint. And I use Azo Yellow because I like how transparent it is, a little bit of yellow. And we have a lovely green. Now, if you want a slightly lighter green for your green that sort of is on the bluff there, I'm going to start with my Azo Yellow, add a little bit of cobalt, little tiny bit, and I've got a lighter green. Or you can use lemon. Lemon makes a very nice light green. I've got a little bit of light green for just that little bit of greenery that's on the dry grass bluff. Let's add a little bit more paint. So we've got two greens. I do buy a couple of greens. I use phthalo green I buy, and sap green I buy. And I do have a permanent green light. I hardly ever use it because the greens that you mix are always so much nicer. So much more natural. Right, let's zoom in again on the trees. And I will use my number 2 brush, I think. You don't want one that's too big because these trees are not very big unless your paper's huge. And let's get something to rest my wrist on so I don't make my paper dirty with paint. And I will start, you can start wherever you like. I always start at the top of the tree. That's just me, that's what I do. And I kind of just do little dots on the paper and then kind of join the dots as the branches go out. So I've got my photograph right in front of me. So I want to sort of form the shape of the tree pretty much like the photograph. You know what, I'm just grabbing some of that light green on my brush so that I have a bit of variation. So one side of these branches is maybe a touch lighter than the other side. Notice in the photograph that they are not even You don't have like even coming out, even coming out. This side's coming out kind of like quite big. This side's kind of short and choppy. And then this branch that's here is quite big. And then there's a little bit of greenery on the end of this branch that I have to put in a moment, because that's what I mean. When I find the tree, then I find where the branches need to go quite often. And there's a bit of a tree leaning over here. And that's the first tree. We've got quite a lot of trunk showing, so make sure you leave a lot of trunk showing. Now the top of the other tree, I'm going to use my burnt sienna grey, because I've got to get a bit more paint on my brush. The top of the tree is just mainly dead branches. So I've got my sort of burnt sienna grey on the top of my tree. And you might say, why didn't you do that when you were doing the branches? Why didn't my mind wasn't in doing the tree at that point. It was just, my mind was put in a few of the branches, and I didn't have the right color at that point. And now I'm going to grab my green, because sort of halfway down here, it has got some greenery on. And a little bit here. And then some bare branches and a little bit here. And of course, some of this greenery could be from the tree next to it. Who knows? Doesn't matter. You just paint what you see, or what you invent if you know a lot about trees. And this tree has got a tiny bit of greenery up here. Patterns out here. There's a bit of a crossover. And it's a very small amount here. Here. Very minimal greenery on these. A little bit here. And of course, eventually, when we've done the tops of the trees, there's going to be greenery down here too, under the trees. We're not going to worry about that right now. Grab my Kleenex, because what I want to do is just want to lighten a little bit of that tree. Just a tiny bit. Right, and I'm dipping in my paint frequently, so that I have plenty of paint on my brush and it's nice and liquid. I'm just trying to find my way on these trees. There's a conglomeration of green in the middle, and it's unclear where it's coming from. So I'm not going to question where it comes from. I'm just going to form the shape that I see. So I'm coming up here. I'm going to grab a little bit of the lighter green coming up here. And again, there'll be greenery under here too when we get to it. The reason we painted all the sky behind it is you want to see the sky in between all of the greenery on the trees. You notice on this one, I didn't start from the top like I have on the others. It was sort of because I was trying to connect this tree and this tree as I saw them coming up the slope here. I'm just mostly using little dots, but sometimes I connect those dots so that they're not all disjointed. And don't do so much that you fill in every little space. You need the space, you need the open space between these trees. The same when you put in the greenery underneath the trees. Some of the greenery has space between it. There's a bit of greenery coming up here, but then you can see sky. There's actually, behind this one, there's rock. Put that into, and coming up to the rock. It doesn't matter if it's wet in wet. I'm taking the greenery up to that rock that I just put in. But the greenery that's up above the rock face has sky between it. And when you come down closer to the rock face, I'm going to add a little bit more blue into my green because it's much darker. This is more solid. And it also comes down the rock face. As I come out towards the light, I'm going to go lighter with the green again. Come out here. And then darker as it closes in close to the rock face. I'm going back to my lighter green. If you look, just here, there's sort of like a patch of grass just here. I'm going to put that in so it can just work wet in wet into the dark green. And just up here. And I'll go back to putting in the dark green. And I'll just let it blend with that little bit of lighter grass that I put in. Now I'm going even darker. I want to add a bit more ultramarine and burnt sienna to the green. Go darker still. So that in some of these areas here, maybe here, I have some really nice dark shadows. And of course, if any of them look too dark, you can take your thirsty brush and you can just pull them out and lighten them up just a little bit. And make sure that the tops under your trees here are not a straight line. It can be a straight line here where it comes in because there's a rock face there that comes down, and that's okay. But some of this greenery should be broken up so that you can see the leaves, you can see the shadows. And as my tree color is drying a bit, I just want to to darken it just a little bit on one side. And then with the very light green, I'm doing a dry brush again. So getting my brush in the green and then I'm drying it off. I'm going to test it on my test paper. And I just want to drag a little bit of, maybe I need a bit more, drag a bit of green across some of this burnt sienna area. Not too much, there's just a little bit here and there. Definitely don't need very much. Just lighten that up a tiny bit. So I still have some rock shadows to do and some rock shadows to do here. So I need my dark grey. I need to mix up a bit more dark grey for that. I'm just going to do that. Ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Yeah, a little bit more. And so I want a bit more definition in these rocks coming down here. And I'm going to go to my number 2 brush. And I want to put these shadows in down here. A little bit of burnt sienna in there too. A bit of burnt sienna showing in the rocks. I want to get a more craggy edge to this a little bit. And then a little bit of texture on these rocks here. Adding a bit more shadow to this one. I'm sort of going between the burnt sienna and the grey. For these closer rocks here, they have quite a warmth to them. So sometimes I'm using burnt sienna, sometimes I'm using grey. Now there's a couple of things we have to do. We have to get the green reflections in here, and we have to get a few brown details on the logs, give them a bit more detail. So first, because we have some green probably left, I have a bit here, and maybe I'll mix it up a bit more. I'll mix the light and the dark green all together. So I've got quite a bit. And I want some fairly clean water. And I'm going a little bit fast now. I'm getting close to finishing time. So I'm going to put a little bit of water here where I want my reflections. Because I want the green and the sandy color to blend in. And then a very small brush, I've got my two. I'm going to get my green color. I'm going to mix it a little less watery so it's not too, if it's too watery, it will go all over the place. You don't want it all over the place, you want it a bit more controlled. So first of all, is a little bit here, a little bit at a time, go a little bit at a time. If it gets away from you, just wait and let the water dry up just a little bit. Or mix your paint a little bit thicker. If your paint's thicker than the water, it won't go as far. It will sit where you put it. I'm putting in some reflections of the trees here. And I'm going to do some dry brush when this is sort of a bit of green up to the shore here. I'm not ready to do the dry brush yet. A little bit of burnt sienna. A bit of burnt sienna here. Really subtle. We're going really subtle now. And one thing you can do is when this is dry, you can lift some highlights off, which is often a great way to go with reflections. I'm adding a little bit of quite dry burnt sienna so that it doesn't flood everywhere. And then a little bit of grey brown from the rocks. I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna to the grey. And then there's some grey-brown reflections from the rocks here. Now, if your paint's too wet, it will go all over the place, so make sure your paint's fairly dry. And then I'm going to do a little bit of dry brush. So I want my number 4 brush with the green on. And then again, dab some up on the towel. I'm going to drag it across this test paper to see if I get a nice dry brush drag, and I do. And hopefully I've left enough of this dry that I can, oh, still a bit too much on there. I can drag that dry brush out. Remember, these are starting to go parallel to the shoreline. Go gently. If you keep dragging, you'll get there. Don't press too hard. And it sort of eases along the shoreline here. You can almost hear, you may be able to hear my brush kind of scrubbing as it I don't like to do that too much to my brushes, but there, I've got a little bit of that green dragged across. Now I want to go to my zero brush. I'm going to put a bit more blue with my green to darken it up, and maybe even a little bit of burnt sienna to darken it up. There is a very dark edge. Everything is drying up now, so it's going to make it stronger when I put the color on. I want it stronger. So it's dark here, and I've got a very thin brush, so I can make some little thin lines coming out from the edge of these reflections. Come along here, get a bit more dark paint, and right here there are some stronger green reflections and some lines coming out. So we've got the dry brush and some lines. So I've got a couple of ways of making these reflections here. Again, I'm kind of dragging the line out so it's not too crisp. If you do get it too crisp, use a wet brush to soften it a little bit. I'm going back and forth now, wiggle with my brush, wiggling in some reflections. And I want some darker, a little bit darker grey reflections. I want a bit more of my dark grey. And some here from the rocks. And just a couple from these rocks here. There's not many from the rocks here because of the angle of the sun, I guess, or lack of sun that we had, but a little bit of light, a little bit of sun. We've got that little bit of reflection. Now, I usually come back with a third layer on dry paper and put a bit more on when the paper's dry, because you can get a better effect just putting a little bit more reflection on, or a little bit more dry brush on when you've got dry paper. It works better. I'm adding just a little bit more dry brush burnt sienna. Having trouble getting enough on my small brush. There we go. A little bit more. And I'll show you what I mean about when it's dry, you can use a stiffer brush, like this is a little stiff brush for taking off paint. This is a perfectly dry one. If I want to take off some rock reflections, I can wiggle this brush back and forth and then dab with my Kleenex. And I can take off paint so that I can get some light reflections back. So if you've done all of your reflections and you think they're a bit dark, then find yourself a little tiny brush like this. You can use any type of acrylic brush, or this one is specifically for watercolor. And you can agitate the paint off and then dab it with a Kleenex, and you'll get some lovely ripples and light reflections in the water. It's a lovely way to do reflections. And all of these colors we've used, they will all do that. We've used colors that are very, very easy to lift off. You can see how easily they all lift. The greens, the blues, the grays, the browns, all of them will lift. This little brush is called an eradicator. So you can, if you get to the end and you think my reflections got lost, it has to be dry, probably like tomorrow, and then that's a great time to go in and lift a few off. So there's just one more thing that we have to do, and that is put a bit more brown on these logs dark brown. So I'm mixing up the burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, same mix, making it a nice dark brown. Got quite a lot of paint. So to make it a nice dark brown, you just need to add a little bit more burnt sienna. And my small brush is 0 or 2 or something like that. And I just want to do a few detail lines on these logs. Just a few sort of shadows on the log. Sometimes if it's your last layer, you can smudge it, pull it with your fingertip if you want to just smudge it in. You can, if you feel like you want to get the edge of this log with a thin brush, you can just outline the bit that's next to the other log again. Pull with your finger, outline here. And you probably want to get the part of the edge here, some of the shadow. And like I said, we don't want too much detail on this one. A little bit, not too much, just enough to sort of show the end of the log. This one here we can do more detail on for sure. I'm going to use the knot. There's a big knot on this one here. I'm going to use that and play with that shape. So that's sort of here. I'm not going to make it like really, really detailed, but I do want to have that kind of that swirl of the knot here and some of the swirls of the grain going around it. And then there's some sort of wavy lines going under it. Above. A bit of a wavy line here. And again, if you just want to really, really lightly outline it, just so you can see the edge, that's fine. As long as you've got a really thin brush and a fine line. And of course, on the underside of the log, it's going to be much, much darker. So you can put some dark shapes. Dry brush. I just dried my brush off and dragged it along the log, so I got that kind of dry brush texture. I used a little bit of water. I'm gonna make more of the edge here so that this edge comes up and forms part of that texture that I've put here. You see what I mean? Coming up to the edge in the way that on this here comes up to this edge and then comes back. I'm definitely not doing it as detailed or as strong as the photo. I'm just using those details for a little bit of inspiration. And again, I'm not going to do detailed stuff on the edge of the log, just a little bit of suggestion. I'm going to get a bigger brush so that I don't fiddle with the detail on the edge here. Number 8. Put a little bit more burnt sienna in the brown. And you'll notice that this here is really quite loose. And it's up to you how much detail you want to do, whether you want it really, really tight detail, whether you want to sit for a couple of hours putting in all of this detail in the darks, or if you just want to do it loose like I have. Watercolor is often just about doing a loose suggestion of something where you kind of see the shadows. I want a little bit more blue in with my brown now. Slightly more blue. Take those shadows around that side. Make them a little cooler. And I'm going to pull back so you can see it's not quite as bizarre as it looks as I'm just sort of throwing in that dark paint. Getting that edge. What I'm feeling as I'm doing this one, although I don't want too much detail on the one in the middle, as I'm putting in that dark paint, it does make me feel that I need a bit more, little bit more dark on this one, just to balance it out. And maybe a little bit more shading on that one. I want the three logs to at least balance, not be too dissimilar. So I've just put that little bit more dark on the two of them. And again, if I come and look at this tomorrow in the morning, I may think, oh, I want a little bit more on there. It needs a little bit more. Even on these rocks over here, I might come out in the morning and think, oh, that needs a bit more playing with it. And what I will probably definitely do when this is dry is I'll probably add a little bit more dark green. It's not quite dry enough yet, but just that's a little bit extra. Anyway, I'm going to pull back as far as that goes so you can see the whole painting as one. And sometimes I just want to take a little bit off too. And I actually thought that would be very quick and that we would be done really fast. Shows you how wrong I can be sometimes. But that's okay. I hope you all hung in there till the bitter end. I think what does take the time is those final details, the little bits of reflection, the little bits of detail on the logs. I do feel that maybe this one's a bit too smooth as I'm looking at it. Maybe want just a little bit more. Not a lot, just maybe a tiny bit more detail. But there you go. Anyway, we are done that one for today. Next week we go back to one of Connie Lacey's beautiful sunsets, and it will be a much pinker sunset this time, looking at Mount Baker in a very, very pale blue. So you get to kind of practice what you did last week, but with slightly different colors and a very slightly different composition. And that, I think that's just really valuable to keep practicing something with different values or just slightly differently. How did your painting turn out? That took much longer than I expected. I thought it was going to be a really simple little one, but the details in the rocks and the logs, and I kept getting my rocks and logs mixed up. But anyway, next week we'll be back to Cobble Hill and another one by Connie Lacey. So have a good Thanksgiving, Canadians.
and see you next week. Bye for now.